thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. The last event for us today as part of Leeds Digital Festival. It's a really important session, I think. So it's around home working, a psychological perspective for looking after yourself. So we are recording today's session, and we do want you to share any thoughts that you may have or any questions using the Q&A functionality, which we will have time to go through at the end of the session. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rob, who's leading our session today.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. The first version of this talk arose back when all of this was new, because there was an awful lot of work that went into thinking about home working, but from the working side of it all. And as a psychotherapist, as well as a digital consultant for Spark and BGSS, I thought, well, what's going to happen to us if we start mashing together our home life and our work life? And what would I say to myself or to other people? And I had a little think, and I thought, well, I would pretty much say what I'd always say whenever a new client came in to the therapy room to talk about their problems. And that's to divide it out into three rough big chunks. And I'm going to take you through those three big chunks. And the first thing is I would get people to account for what's going on, list them, take a moment to reflect, not just things that there are on the top of your mind, but what's going on in the background. What might you be noticing or just, sweeping under the proverbial psychological carpet? And then having accounted for there's this and there's this and there's this and there's that, how are you coping with those? And are your coping mechanisms serving you really, really well, or are you slipping away slightly, or do they come with a certain cost? And to this, I've added a canvas, because we're consultants and we love canvases, that actually a colleague of mine, Thaddeus, found, that takes a lot of these and displays them in graphical form, which makes it really, really easy for you to have a conversation with your colleagues or your partner or your older children or just yourself. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend most of the time accounting and looking at coping, and then talk through relatively briefly how you can use, hopefully, some of the ideas and reflections that come up as you listen to me, to think again about what's happening to you. Because, of course, we've had a reset. It's been 6 months, and it's going to be another 6 months, probably, as far as anybody knows. And in that time, there's a heck of a lot going on, too much for many of us to take in all at once. So I'm going to break this down into a few easier to digest chunks for you. So first of all, I want to look at what's going on in the background. What is stressing us, whether we like to think about it or not? And first of all, there's a whole set of global stressors. We are in the middle of a global pandemic. When will it end? when will it end? Well, not anytime soon, so far as we're aware. I mean, we'd all love there to be a miracle cure or a miracle vaccine, but chances are we're stuck with this for a goodly while. At the beginning of the pandemic, people quite often had an analogy with the war. And it's kind of that sort of thing, but not as bad. Certainly wars have tended to go on longer, so heaven forfend that this goes on for 6 years like the Second World War did. You may be thinking about illness itself, or yourself getting ill. I had a cold last week, and I knew it was a cold because my son had given it to me because he'd gone to school and they'd all come back with colds. But I knew that as soon as I went out into the public, people would go, "Oh, that man's coughing." And even I vaguely wondered. Death is around, death is in the news. And it can be quite addictive, kind of attaching yourself to this death news. you know, not only what's happening here, but the appalling stuff that's happening in America or Brazil, or, you know, you can read any of the papers and it's full of it, top to tail. You can feast out on the agony of a world gripped in a pandemic. I put Staring at the Sun here, one of the best books in the therapy canyon dealing with death. One of my favorites is a book called Staring at the Sun. And the metaphor that the author wanted to get across to us is that, like the sun, death is something that we all occasionally glance at, but it's just not healthy to stare at all the time. It doesn't serve us well. It leads us to nihilism and depression and darkness. It also is just this simple fact around these background stresses that everything is just a little bit harder. I'm expecting a delivery. I've been expecting a delivery all day. Of course it's bound to come in the middle to talking to a couple of hundred people. Thank you very much, well-known leading online supplier. On top of those background stresses, there's all these domestic stresses that are going on right in front of us, right with us, without the separation that we used to get from going to work. Firstly, you may be putting yourself under a lot of self-stress to carry on as normal, keep calm and all that, to maximize yourself and just pretend that nothing's happened, or at least if you acknowledge that something has happened, you know, stiff upper lip, mustn't grumble. We don't like to complain. We don't like to share our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses. And it's often easier for us to worry about our loved ones than it is to worry about ourselves, not least if you have elderly relatives or you are living with somebody with an underlying health condition, or even if not. There are a lot of people who are prone to putting others first. I mean, I put e.g. mums as a classic profile of people, but you know, I've had a busy day, the sun's shining, I haven't been out at all this lunchtime, I probably should go out, but there's a team meeting, I don't want to disappoint my team, what am I going to do? I'm probably going to go to the team meeting and make sure I cheer everybody else up. There's the stress of what's happening to your partner. Some of you may be with your partner. When this first came out, the Open University calculated that most people, instead of spending 2.5 hours a day during a working day with their partners, were suddenly spending 15 hours a day. That may be lovely, but if you haven't negotiated how to be when you're at work and when you're not at work, or who does what, or who shares what, then it could be sources of friction. And of course, you'll all be aware of the great growth, sadly, in domestic violence during this period. There's obviously been job and financial stresses. I'm lucky enough to work with BGSS, which has been enormously successful during this period, and indeed we're actively recruiting, hint. But, you know, your partner may be a key worker, or your partner may, like mine, have lost their jobs as their businesses went under. Now, luckily, my partner's found a job almost immediately, but it's a really, really difficult position for a lot of people. And then finally, under domestic stress, what domestic stress looks like is so diverse. You know, my experience as a partner and a dad living in a house is very different from one of my stepsons who has just gone to university and has been told that he can't go home for Christmas because he lives in Scotland and his mum lives in Scotland. Whether you're living in shared houses, whether you're living with strangers, lodgers, whether you're living alone, it's all very atomizing in its experience. Suddenly your experience can be very, very different from everybody else's experience. Whereas when you're at work, there's a togetherness at being with work, and now all that's broken down. And with that breakdown, there's also been the breakdown in our boundaries between me and we, between home and work. heaven knows I would ever miss the hour commute I used to have to do to go from my village in Derbyshire to our Nottingham office. But actually, that was a real transition time when I stopped being Robert at home and went into being Robert at work, and was different and felt different, and then could come back together again. And it's led to a situation where and I think a lot of people, feel like you're always on. There's never a moment when you can really truly relax, because you're working in the place where you would normally relax. So it's so easy to compromise your time boundaries, whereas before you had to commute to work, however long that was, and you pretty much normally had to go out, unless you chose not to, for your lunchtime to get something to eat, and then you had to come home. All of that's gone. So work time, lunchtime, family time, me time, they can all chop and change. I frequently find myself doing laundry whilst I'm working, and because the washing machines are just behind me and it's just shuffling one into another, but you know, it breaks my concentration, and am I at work or am I not at work? It's a trivial example, but when that's multiplied by being with someone who's also at work, who's also having their boundaries slightly blurred by all of this, and you know, thank goodness the children have gone back to school, because for 6 months, you know, I had a 9-year-old tottering around behind me, apparently needing feeding and all sorts of things during the day whilst I was at work. And then there are a whole series of work stresses. Now, I'm not going to major on these, because an awful lot of the advice about working from home has been about the working bit of working from home. BGSF's website's got some great stuff under /remote. But I just wanted to acknowledge that basically everything is a bit harder. We work in an agile way, and agile normally presumes that you're co-located, shoulder to shoulder, interacting, lots of spontaneous little moments of, you know, Rob, could you just have a little look at this? The decision making in agile is very collaborative, which really is strengthened by being together and being a group activity. And it's very much about blended teams, collaborative teams, and all of that is a lot harder. BGSS also is an agency, so we need to quickly build a rapport with a new set of clients, and of course that's all a great deal harder. But even when you're having a down day, actually that's harder, because when you could go to the office, a bit of presenteeism, just kind of bumbling along but clearly being there, has got harder, because it's harder to prove that you're working, to be seen to be working, when you can't be seen. So there's almost a self-pressure to be more productive than you would be if you were at work. But the main concern for me, I think, is, aside from these stresses that we're carrying and the boundaries that are blurred, is the psychological impact, which, as you can see, I've broken down into a lot of stuff. So let me just zoom in a little bit so we don't get too overwhelmed. We're living in what has been termed, and I think it's a great expression, a social recession. We all know what an economic recession is, when economic activity declines across the country. Well, a social recession is exactly the same, but our social interaction has declined across the country and is set to remain at a low level through until next March, probably, and then who knows when. And it's meant that our, in what's called I'm using, by the way, cognitive behavioural therapy and transactional analysis terms, and it's caused a decline in what's called the stroke economy, where a stroke is a measure of attention, that you're noticed, that you have an impact in your social world. And we chop up that kind of idea around strokes into what happens when you don't get a lot of positive strokes. Who knew that going to work was such a positive experience? And I'm not talking about like people wildly coming in and saying, oh, Robert, what a great job, and you know, heartily patting me on the back. It's just having lots of people smiling at me as I come in the morning saying, oh, morning, Rob. How are you? The little trivial, waiting for the coffee to be made, conversations that you spontaneously have, chatting to people who notice you and are pleased to see you. And if we don't get positive strokes, it's really easy to fill that void, because nature hates the void, with negative strokes. So if I'm not being seen and my work isn't being seen, then it's really easy for me, and I mean me, I don't mean one, I mean me, to go to a place of people must imagine that I'm being lazy, or I'm struggling, or not doing very well. And if people aren't seeing what you're doing, it's really easy to imagine, well, if no one seems to care what am I doing, what's the point? Why should I care if I'm not getting these tiny little repeat addictive social reinforcements? And it's easy to fall victim to hunger for more. I mean, I have a lovely little study in my lovely home, and it's the best place I could be, but I'm just a little bit bored of the view outside my study window of the houses across the road and the car that I have that goes so few places these days. We call these hungers out in therapy so that it's easy to see where people are going wrong. So as I go through this, have a little reflection to yourself about where you might be struggling. So the first one is structure hunger, organizing and chopping up your day into discrete bits. We kind of like order. My son, my 9-year-old son, when he went to school the first time a few weeks ago, said it was better than Christmas morning. And he said that, I'm sure, because finally, not only would he meet his friends and do something interesting, but finally his day would be organized for him with stuff going on, what to do next. And associated with the hunger to actually have a structure in your day is for stuff to happen, for incidents to happen, highs, dramas, spontaneities, something. We are very boredom aware. We don't like the same thing over and over again. And when you're stuck in the same place over and over again, your mood will decline. And you will hunger for stimulus, something to satisfy your senses. I don't know about you, but I've been struggling with putting on weight, and that's partly because when I go shopping, I'm like, oh, I could have this, I could have that. It's one of the few areas where I can immediately satisfy and stimulate me, as opposed to, oh, I'm popping down to see clients in London today, and that would be fun, or at least interesting, because I'll go on the train and I'll see sights and I'll interact with people that I don't normally interact with, and I'll be stimulated. And as I'm stimulated, I will often be recognized, psychologically recognized. I will be seen and seen to matter. And again, this can be as trivial as just before we all began, I was talking to Karen, our moderator here, and she's moving house, and talking about the backgrounds. Oh yes, and wouldn't it be nice to have a different background? And that's an interesting background. And then I felt that my background had simulated her background, and just in a tiny way, you know, I mattered for that small moment. And individually, it's trivial, but collectively, it's massive. And it leads to this hunger for contact with people, to touch them. I mean, emotionally touch them. I mean, physically touch them is nice too, but emotionally touch them. And to have that time when you twin with people and you are the same for that moment. You're not isolated, you're close. And then finally, sexual hunger. Now, who knew the office would play a big part in sexual hunger? And of course, it's not the whole orgasmic swinging from the chandeliers area of sex. Well, aside from a few fortunate people, I imagine. It's just the sense of, oh, I don't know, if I'm going to go to a pitch with a client and, you know, I've dressed up and I'm wearing shiny shoes and I'm looking smart and people notice that. Now it's not sexual, but it's erotic. It's saying I'm attractive. If you've gone in and you've had, you know, a nice haircut and people remark on your haircut, again, that's just a teeny tiny little piece of erotic exchange. You're an attractive person. And, you know, again, individually trivial, collectively, this is huge. And without those kinds of strokes, you will be prone to what I call mental feeling poorly. We don't have great words in English for being a bit mentally under the weather. You know, you don't go into the office and say, well, I got a bit of a mental twinge today. You're either bonkers or you're sane. And we don't have much vocabulary of the stuff in between. Now, for some of you, this will have hit much, much, much harder. And I'm hoping that you, through your experience of your hardships in the past, are dealing with this by reaching out for the kind of help that you reached out in the past and using the lessons you learned from those past instances. But for those of you who are unused to feeling mentally poorly and having a mental twinge, you may not notice that you've gone to a sadder place. And I've divided these out into these 4 broad areas. And I want to say, these are all appropriate areas for you to go to. If you feel any or all of these, that's fine. It would be odd, in a way, if you'd felt nothing, given the social recession and the decline in our strokes that we've had. I list out these 4 because these are 4 super popular. There are others, there are many others. Psychology is a wonderful thing. But these are classic ways where you might start to struggle. So you might start to struggle socially, which would be easy to do given the limitations in social contact that we have. You might well feel that no one will miss me if I'm not around kind of feeling, and feel yourself shrink into yourself and either fade away from your friendships or indeed your family, or find yourself increasingly shy and out of practice of talking to people. You may feel anxiety in its 2 different forms. So obviously there's the classic form of anxiety of that, you know, tension and restlessness and your head boiling and persistent negative thoughts swimming around, or a general sense of pessimism, possibly even sort of the more paranoid end of anxiety. Or you may feel anxiety coming out as anger. And anxiety can come out as anger because anxiety is a trapped emotion. Anxiety is, there's something happening and I can't deal with it. You know, people have stage fright before public speaking because it's before. They can't actually do the thing. Here, you may feel anxiety because death is all around us and lockdown or semi-lockdown is going to carry on for the next 6 months. And there's nothing you can do. You can't create a vaccine. You can't heal people. And that anxiety hums and fizzes around inside you. And then you may suddenly find yourself a bit snappy. I certainly found myself tut-tutting. My anger when it comes out is quite a flouncy anger. And I go, Jesus Christ, you have no idea what the rules of social distancing are, in a sort of huffy Victor Meldrew way. And you can experience anger in any of that forms. It's not just the mad, shouty, explosive anger that we commonly think of as anger. It can be implosive. It can go into you. You can go into a mood and almost bend the walls with your inner rage and fury that you're not expressing. Or there can be the dead to me anger. You just cut yourself off from everybody else. So just notice if you've gone to those places, particularly if they're a bit flashy and just bubble up all of a sudden. It's because underneath it all, you're experiencing anxiety. And anxiety's best friend is depression. They often walk hand in hand down into ugly places. And depression can be surprisingly tricky to self-diagnose because the slide into depression can be ever so gradual. The definition, persistent low mood, is just a bit meh. It's not like you have to have operatic depression of, you know, utter despair or anything like that. It can just be quite a subtle blackness, sadness. I go to ennui, a sense of lacklusterness, not knowing what to do with myself. Everything's just a bit grey and lifeless. It's depression. It's not a major depressive episode. It's just one of these twitches, being a bit poorly depressive, but it's still part of the depressive spectrum. And then finally, you may be somatically, physically ill, which is to say, yes, you may have a real illness. So muscle pains, headaches, indigestion, IBS, all those sorts of things are classic psychosomatic illnesses. Psychosomatic is often used as if it's not real. It's really real. It's just that you've transferred the negative energy in your psyche down into your body. And that's not surprising because the two are really intimately linked, as I'll probably talk about a little bit. And loneliness and isolation are the biggest single pathopsychological stimulus to this kind of thing. So just notice when you or if you have visited these places. And again, it doesn't have to be all the time. With mental twinges, you can go into them and come back out of them and then go back into them. They're very much a flow state by the moment, by the hour, by the day, by the week. So that's a little tour of what's happening around for us. What can we do about it? Well, the good news is a heck of a lot. So first of all, I'm going to go into just briefly the unhelpful ways of coping. So unhelpful is in inverted commas. It's unhelpful in the long term, but give yourself some slack. This is a really difficult time, and you may, like me, have been overeating, but it's not the worst thing in the world. The main two things I see people going into is either going into self, such as overeating or overdrinking, or staying too still, or into going what I called student mode, which is a classic from that lack of time boundaries and stuff. So you suddenly stop having a proper routine, and instead you're just guided by, what do I want to do next? Obviously, people who live by themselves are more prone to that. The good, in inverted commas, ways of coping are really well understood. There are lots of people like astronauts and nuns and oil rig workers and submariners who do social distancing as a matter of course. And their way of coping is taken straight out of the playbook for dealing with anxiety and depression. There is effectively no difference. Exercise, making sure that you do something that changes your viewpoint, is so important. Excuse me one moment, there's bloody Amazon. Slick. Right, thank you. And along with exercise, sleep and relaxation. So same kind of spirit. These both tackle your body, and your body is so important for your mental well-being. Your body isn't just some sort of brain transporter. Your head's not just in a glass jar separated from the whole thing. Your body is intimately linked to your brain. If a lion suddenly appeared in this study, somewhat improbably, my body would psychologically tell me what to do long before my brain worked out anything cognitive about it. It's on a tripwire of activity through hormones that send messages between the brain and the body. So if you deal with the body, you are also dealing with your brain and your mood and your well-being. I also recommend a certain sense of positivity, not in a kind of Pollyanna, oh, it's all going to be fine. No, it's really, really difficult. However, unplugging yourself from the death news and reframing events a little bit more positively can really, really help. Yes, I'm stuck at home, or I'm in the most comfortable place that I've nested for myself with all my bits around me to deal as best as possible in this circumstance. I noticed the government started using the term circuit breaker rather than lockdown, which is one that they borrowed, I think, from Singapore, that used that much more attractive reframing of people doing stuff. Routine, rather than the time structure that I spoke about before. Staying close to people, I mean, self-evidently, but you know, making it a conscious effort. I really recommend paying attention to the strokes for your little self. Being silly, playing games, you know, this is such a serious time full of death and illness and worry and what you can't do. Make sure you make time for your little Roberts and whoever you are to just enjoy stuff, because there's not a lot you can do, so you might as well amuse them the most. And do what I've encouraged you to do today, which is account for what's going on. How are you feeling? And noting that your feelings, you know, a bit like the clouds, can just change quite readily. What responsibilities are you carrying? What have you lost that you might be able to do something to replace? I can't tell you how happy I am that I watched a YouTube video for how to use my little Nespresso machine, which has been wonderful, on making a pretty passable flat white last week. So I'm thrilled at that. Know your signs for when you're not doing so well, and what might trigger that to happen. And I'm personally a strong fan of journaling. So here's some extracts of my journal. When I first did this talk back in April, you could see that my mood was going down. The April here wasn't a full month. And I could see that, you know, my ability to relax had gone down, whilst my achievement of chores had shot up, and watching telly had shot up, and the number of nice meals I'd had gone down. Now, some of that's fine. You know, it's okay to watch a little bit more telly than you usually would, because we're in this situation. So why not use it? But use it mindfully. Use it in a way where you know what you're doing rather than you're just drifting into it. Here's my September update. So you can see, you know, I'm still having a lot of difficulty relaxing, although obviously a holiday in August did me a power of good. And my mood, and I'm a happy chappy, my mood should be higher than this. I was looking at my mood summary from the previous year, and it only went into yellow when I was in hospital with a serious infection. That's what yellow means to me. So I'm, you know, usually much higher than this, and you can see I'm still struggling to stay chipper throughout the whole thing. With your work, I strongly encourage you to go with your personality style. So if you're an extrovert, make sure you take time to chat with people. If you're an introvert, well, what a wonderful time to be an introvert, but even so, you can have, you know, too much of a good thing. So, you know, if you don't want to appear your face on Zoom videos all the time, then, you know, just, it's okay to, you know, turn it off. So you're not stared at all the time. And if you're like me, an ambivert, halfway between, then, you know, just notice your flow. So I love doing things like this. And then once I've done it, I'll have to have a little lie down and perhaps a noodle in a good spreadsheet. Make sure that your workload, you know, all these meetings. I mean, thank you for coming to a meeting to tell you not to go to meetings, but it's really, you know, really difficult. Try and do more outside meetings. Try and have meetings that are only 50 minutes long, so you might have a chance to make a cup of tea and go to the toilet in between meetings rather than having 4 hours of them. Reject the odd meeting where you don't think you're that good. There's certainly, obviously, some trends. I mean, many of you are seeing this little witticism going around of, you know, who leads your digital transformation, COVID-19. It certainly transformed our working world. And obviously, it's changed the attitude around productivity and hours and being in the office. And remote working has always been good for concentration and decision making. And working sort of considerate hours has obviously been given a boost. And obviously there's reluctance to actually return to the office, not only on the grounds of safety, but on the grounds of, well, for me personally, I'm not sure I want to travel 400 miles a week to spend 8 hours commuting for its lifestyle and environmental impacts when I have a desk here. So unless I'm going to do something unique that really is much better done collaboratively, then I don't really see the point in just going back to sitting at a desk. So those are some of the ways, some less good, some better, that you can deal with coping with it. But the biggest thing is being aware of what's going on. So this canvas, I'll share in the chat and afterwards a link to this Miro board so you can look at it yourself. But this canvas is a great way of talking about what's going on. You don't have to fill in the whole thing. You just pick the things that pop out to you as being particularly problematic, and then decide how you're going to have a conversation with your partner and your adult children, with your colleagues, or with yourself, so that you can just address some of the things that are slightly going less well, and yeah, help yourself over these psychological twinges that you might have. And I would suggest give yourself permission to be suboptimal in this slightly broken world. You know, we can't carry on as if nothing's happening. It really, really is. And it's really difficult and it takes its toll. And if you don't acknowledge that toll, it will build up. So do yourself a favor and don't be overwhelmed by this great complexity, but it's all around us, but there is something we can do about it. So that's me. I'm going to stop sharing there. I'm really interested in any questions or reflections that you may be having.
So we have had a few that have come in. Let's have a look. So one quite early on was about, you know, obviously there's people that have got families abroad. So yeah. How do people cope with that, given that they're not able to kind of fly, you know, because of restrictions on COVID? So it may not be a work thing that's affecting them, but obviously it's ostensibly a personal thing.
Yeah, no, it's absolute. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many different domestic situations of all shapes and sizes. So two things. On the work side is make sure that your squad lead or your manager is aware that this is an additional stress that you're having, and that you are worried about it, and that there's, you know, inconsistent level of what you can do, because the advice around traveling and all the rest of it keeps on changing at the drop of a hat. Obviously with the family, all you can do is try and keep contact with them and acknowledge the stress. So it's not just keeping contact with them and having a nice chat, it's saying your worries, speaking out loud. We are very British, and we don't really like saying we're worried about each other. But I mean, and you can, dial it down. You don't have to be like, ah, but, I'm a little bit concerned. And it's been difficult for me a little bit sometimes. You can put in all those qualifiers, but let them know that you're on their minds, and no doubt they'll be on yours too.
Fab. And then what do you think employers should be doing to help their employees' mental health during this time, apart from constant Zooms? Because I think that was one thing that I was going to pick on, that, this is a lot of its onus on us, but actually is there something that employers should be doing?
Yeah. Employers obviously are in a tricky position. The guidance keeps on changing, which is not helpful. The environment they really control, the office, is largely forbidden to them. And a lot of the management is done by, people like me who kind of do it part-time. I'm a consultant, but I'm also a squad leader. So it comes from the top, really, of just constantly communicating, constantly bothering. More is much better than less. Oh, it's another announcement from the CEO about this, blah, 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 more of the same. It's much better than silence. So if you are a manager, this is absolutely an area where you should overachieve. You should also just expect that there's going to be a toll on people, and that some people are going to need extra support, rather than it being an exception.
Yeah.
So to turn it around from the usual way.
Yeah, because I think, there seems to still be quite a lot of stigma around mental health, even though I think we've come on leaps and bounds. I think that the reality is there still is. One other question was, do you think workplaces should encourage people to take a day off if their mental health is not great, and for employees to feel comfortable to say they are ill due to mental health?
Yes. So the way I would do it, because of course, often people don't like to do that, because then they'll feel guilty about not doing the work or letting their colleagues down as well. So there's an element of self-limiting going on. I would strongly encourage some time shifting. I'm not having a good afternoon or day. I need to go and do something different. I will shift this out and do some stuff at another time to try and make up. But I'm very much struggling just now, and make it a negotiation then, because any decent line manager would then probably, I would say, don't you worry about that. You go out and, get yourself refreshed and a bit better, and then come back and we'll talk about it. But if you come with the sense of wanting to, but not able to, then it's much easier for managers, I think, to respond with sensitivity and kindness. But yes, they absolutely should be responding with warmth at this time.
And then one more, there's quite a few actually, but do you use an app to track your mood for journaling?
Yeah.
Which one would you recommend?
It doesn't matter, pick one you like. I use one called Dailyo, which allows me to track my mood just by clicking on an icon, if that's all I want to do, or by clicking on an icon or two and then adding some words, if that's what I'd like to do. So a lot of journals, you feel almost like a tyranny that you have to write something. So I find Dailyo very good, Daylio, for letting me off on bad days when I'm, I can look at boom, boom, boom. Oh, that's it, tracked. But tracking your mood will help with that subtle shift in your mood.
Well, what if somebody you work in brackets more senior with is very insistent with doing certain things now, even though you've already analysed and put in time when you are trying to set boundaries?
Yeah, it's fairly tricky. If they're being insensitive, it kind of promotes then a culture of minimal compliance and presenteeism, and what you can do under the table, what you can get away with, and it's their fault for their inflexibility in putting you in that position, where you are either jeopardizing your mental well-being or just not doing the work very, very well. So yeah, that is tricky. I would, as a therapist, I would recommend getting away with as much as possible and doing the minimum that you have to do in order to look after yourself first. As a line manager, they go get a better line manager. They sound rubbish.
Yeah, and I think, you know, sort of a follow-on to that, you know, what if you don't have anyone to talk to? And I guess, you know, us at BJSS and Spark, there's different avenues we can go down, but I think some people probably don't have that. And, you know, one of the things you mentioned quite early on about there's been an increase in domestic violence. Do you think there's possibly been an increase in sort of workplace bullying? You know, people are suffering because they feel that they don't have a choice. You know, what advice would you give to people in that situation?
I haven't heard there's an increase in workplace bullying. I can imagine that some managers who, for whatever their own inadequacies, feel the loss of control of actually having you be there, and therefore try and control you more tightly, because that's what controlling people try to do. And it's really about their own insecurities. Go find a better manager would be my long-term solution to that. The short-term, again, is go guerrilla. Do what you have to do to look after yourself, because looking after yourself is more important. If they are unpleasantly bullying and it's really affecting your health, then you'll need to make an appointment really with the GP to talk about this and to get some sort of time off for, you know, and go down that formal kind of almost HRE GP kind of route, rather than suffer, because that's, you know, absolutely what I wouldn't want.
No, absolutely. And I think obviously we have run out of time. There's quite a few more questions. So I think because people are still here, we might as well do a couple more. So I'm happy to carry on if you are.
Yeah, no,
this is one that's actually come up a couple of times. So how can you help others when you recognise signs in friends, family or co-workers, especially if they might be reluctant to engage?
So reluctance to engage is often symptomatic of needing help. So, you know, you're kind of in a double bind. Reaching out to them gently. Constantly and repeatedly. So just, it's not to make a big thing of it necessarily, because that can feel overwhelming to people who have gone into self. But if you imagine it physically, it's like you go and sit really near them, but not like too near them, and let them know that you're there. And they will need to come to you to some point, but if you minimize the distance of coming towards you, then that's the best thing you can do. And if you're very concerned, then share your concerns with others in a work context in more senior positions, but staying close, but not overwhelming and not dramatizing it, but staying close and see if they warm to you.
Have you found any good ways to work remotely and keep teams playful and creative to put the silliness back into work to change mindset?
Well, without giving too much of how Spark Nottingham works, we're very fond of cocktails, and I said team meeting, it's really, you know, mixing our own cocktails since we can't go to a cocktail bar. We've done all sorts of things. We've been quite creative, you know, brought, you know, our favorite piece of music to a meeting and chat about it. And actually our favorite artwork was a particularly good one. We have a range of pretty daft warm-up exercises, and I always, you know, personally didn't like a lot of warm-up exercises when it was with workshops and stuff, because they were always a bit silly. But actually now I really value them because they are a bit silly, and, you know, opportunities of silliness in the day are rare. So don't set any limits on it, I would say. Actually, I kind of put a little boundary around it. This is silliness time, but then try and provoke more and more serious levels of silliness.
No, and I think everyone needs a Tanya in their office. I've seen
Absolutely.
lots of stuff that she's doing. So,
Oh yeah, we've done lots of TikTok videos, for example. So many.
did you see the one that Stuart Bullock did? I must share that one actually. We managed to get Stuart to do one. So,
Yeah.
there's one here. I'm finding it really hard to separate my work identity and success with my own value, as it's my own business. And especially now that I'm working from home permanently, the two are hard to separate physically.
Yeah. So I mean, you've got a triple layer cake going on there. It's not just work and home, but it's also your business too. So your investment in it is kind of absolute. There is, where is the other you? So I often talk about your public self and your private self and your secret self. So your public self is self-evident, and your public self has different flavors, your professional public self and your social public self. Your private self is, what happens within your four walls, except of course, I've now got lots of people looking into, into my study here. Your secret self is a really, really valuable part of this, because this is the bit that you don't share with anybody else. There you go, just for transparency's sake, that's what's really going on in the background. Your secret self is something that only you have, and you don't share with your partner or anybody else. And it's a wonderful refuge for play and fantasy and being your own person. Obviously, as an owner and a worker, the weight of responsibility is on you. All you can really do is make sure that you are accounting for it and recognizing how best you are in dealing with it, and being kind to yourself if some of the ways that you're dealing with it are a bit suboptimal, if not actively crap. Because the worst thing that can happen is you get yourself into a cycle of shame around the whole thing. You're not doing very well. You're now guilty, feeling guilty about not doing very well. That makes you not do very well, which makes you, and it goes round and round and round. So some level of acceptance is really important. And going to some of those physical places, it depends on what you like. I prefer to walk. Yoga and mindfulness are really, really good. Apparently, I hate them, but for other people, they work. Actual high power physical activity works for some people. So long as it then doesn't become addictive and becomes another thing you have to do on top of all the other things you have to do, it's fine. But account what's going on, let yourself off the hook, sweep some things under the carpet, and have it acknowledged by someone else. Your partner or people that are close to you.
And this one actually is coming up too soon, I think. As we move into the winter months and daylight is reduced, so our exposure to daylight is even more limited, seeing as we're inside, how do you think we should approach our daylight needs?
Yeah, so people are prone to different levels of seasonal adjustment disorder, SAD. If you know you're prone, then do go to major online retailers and get yourself a light box. I would strongly recommend putting rigid boundaries. Invent a meeting at lunchtime that is you going out, if at all possible, weather permitting. It's so easy to lose perspective if the perspective you're looking at is just the same few feet. Go and look at a distance and breathe some fresh, if cold air. Those are really the two things that you can do. It is a worrying time for people. You can reframe it to a little bit. Yes, it's cold and dark outside, but isn't it nice and snug in here? I'm quite fond to lighting candles because they're warming of the light, they're physically warming, and they're like just a little thing for me. It's a pointless thing for me, but it's a little thing for me. I've done it. And it reminds me of that little bit of self-care. So any of those kinds of little things to spoil yourself a little bit. Yeah, I might add that to my list. Yes, be silly, but yes, also spoil yourself a little bit, are the best ways. Think of yourself in many ways as a young child, or think of the young child within you who just needs a bit of a cuddle and a bit of a hug sometimes, and to be let off school occasionally to go out and play.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there's a couple of questions here that are probably similar, and something that I was going to ask actually. So, you know, you touched upon earlier on about the informal chats that you would have, you know, whether it's at the water cooler or, you know, how do you replicate that without having Zoom fatigue or Slack fatigue? Because you know, as personally, I'm invited to tea breaks every day, and I know my friend is on here, so apologies that I never attend them, but the last thing that I want to do in between, like you say, all these meetings is to have a tea break on Zoom. So how do we keep those conversations going?
It is a problem. You know, our spontaneity is being diarized in Zoom. No, it doesn't really work. One of the best conversations I had was when a manager put a meeting up that he didn't really intend to, and I and another person just found ourselves attending this meeting that wasn't a meeting, and we had a really nice chat for 30 minutes. And that spontaneous accidental thing is so rare. I would recommend, and this is tough, right? This is one of the toughest things, because everything is, you know, you just don't bump into people.
Yeah.
You know, serendipity is really hard remotely. But I would definitely have a chat with your team beforehand, and then establish a norm where it's okay just to ring somebody, not because of anything, but just for a chat. You know, it's like an old style thing. You ring up somebody, do you have a moment to talk? And try and have something around that, so that, you know, you're just checking out how you're doing, rather than let's put a date in the diary, because that kind of just makes it another calendar thing that happens in your calendar life.
Yeah, and I think there's one more that we've probably got time for, and any that we have missed, I'm sure Rob will be happy to sort of do a follow-up blog and just go through any tips and questions that we've not answered. So this is one that I would like to ask as well. So do you have any tips on how to transition from home to work at the start of the day and work to home at the end of the day? Now, I know you have touched on this a little bit, and I'm fortunate enough that I've got an office space, but obviously not everyone does. Is there anything else that we can do to separate that going to work, finishing at lunch, coming back, and then finishing at the end of the day?
So at the beginning, I would put my lanyard on, which was really useful when my partner and my son were around, because it's like, Rob's got his lanyard on, he must be at work. I've stopped doing that since my partner's gone off to her work and my son's gone off to school, because it's a bit pointless now when I'm on my own. I keep quite strict time boundaries, so I don't start work before 9, and I am pretty insistent at stopping at 5, half 5, usually when others come back home. That's great. Lunchtime, I'll be honest, I've struggled to find being able to really take some time to go for a walk and have lunch, maybe have a rest and do something different, come away from the screen. Some days it's good, some days it hasn't been good. You need to find something that is meaningful to you. I'm less in sports leisure gear than I used to be, partly because I was conscious of my weight creeping up, and so now I'm pulling it back down again. So I'm wearing proper trousers so I can feel slightly uncomfortable, which reminds me not to nip into the fridge. But yeah, it's some people like to work in different places for different activities, and that kind of works so that you're geographically moving around. I've preferred to work in my study or out on the decking on a beautiful day when I can, but I prefer to keep my work contained because I have a study, so I want to limit it there, and I don't want to see it when I'm not at work. But it's a very delicate process and a little bit of trial and error. I'm sorry I can't come up with a definitive "you must." It's about how you feel. Do you feel at work? Do you allow yourself to do small chores whilst you're at work? You know, put the dishwasher on or put the washing in the tumble dryer or something, or are you at work and not doing that? It's those little negotiations with yourself that you have to do. Or if you are with other people during your working day, then it makes it clear to them that there's a boundary or not.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Rob. I think we could probably go on for at least another half an hour, but unfortunately I have another session to attend. But we've had a lot of positive feedback and a lot of questions. So anything that we didn't answer, we will make sure when we do the follow-up, we will answer all the questions. There will be a recording as well of the session. And then any of the links, Rob, that you have, or any of the slides that you can share, that would be great, and I will send that to everybody. So thank you so much, and again, thanks for your time today, Robert. It was an absolute pleasure. I found it very useful myself, and I'm sure everyone did that attended.
Okay.
Enjoy the rest of the festival, everybody, and we will see you soon.